She died 3 years ago. The Air Force held her funeral. Then both engines exploded on Delta Flight 2847. As the plane fell from the sky, Black Hawk pilots heard the impossible, "This is Ghost. I'm alive. And I'm saving everyone aboard." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a perfect day for flying. The morning sun rose over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, painting the sky in beautiful shades of pink and gold. The weather was absolutely perfect. Clear blue skies stretched as far as the eye could see. Not a single cloud anywhere. The wind was calm, barely moving at all. Visibility was unlimited. Pilots call this severe clear, the kind of weather where you can see the Cascade Mountains more than 100 miles away, their snow-covered peaks standing sharp and clear against the morning sky. Delta Flight 2847 was scheduled for a routine departure at 6:42 a.m. Seattle to Boston Logan International Airport. A simple cross-country flight that dozens of planes completed every single day without any problems. The flight time would be 4 hours and 20 minutes, maybe 15 minutes more or less depending on the winds high up in the atmosphere. There were 219 passengers booked on this flight. The crew was experienced and professional. They had flown together many times before and knew each other's procedures perfectly. The gate agent made the final boarding announcement at exactly 6:28 a.m. Her cheerful voice echoed through the terminal. Business travelers in dark suits hurried down the jetway, clutching their coffee cups and laptop bags. Many of them were already checking emails on their phones as they walked. Families with young children struggled with strollers and carry-on luggage. Parents juggled toys and snacks to keep their little ones happy and quiet. A few vacationers chatted excitedly about their upcoming trips to the East Coast. They compared notes about must-see attractions in Boston, the Freedom Trail, Fenway Park, the harbor. Nobody noticed anything unusual that morning. Nobody had any reason to suspect that this flight would be anything other than completely, totally routine. It was just another morning departure in the endless rhythm of commercial aviation. Every day, millions of people fly safely across the country. This was supposed to be just one more of those normal, boring flights. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 757-200, registration number N627DL. It was 14 years old but in excellent mechanical condition. This particular plane had just completed a thorough 72-hour maintenance check 2 days earlier. Every single system had been tested, inspected, and certified by experienced mechanics. The landing gear had been carefully examined. The engines had been run through complete diagnostic tests. The flight control surfaces, the ailerons, elevators, and rudder, had been checked to make sure they moved properly. The avionics systems, all the electronic instruments and computers, had been verified and tested. Everything had checked out perfectly. Everything had been signed off by mechanics who had decades of experience maintaining these aircraft. The fuel for this flight was critical, of course. 30,000 pounds of Jet A aviation fuel had been loaded into the aircraft's tanks. This fuel came from the same tank farm that Delta Air Lines had been using reliably for the past 20 years. The fuel was quality tested according to strict FAA regulations. It was approved by quality control inspectors who checked it carefully. It was sealed and delivered through dedicated fuel trucks. These trucks were driven by licensed fuel handlers who performed this job every single day of their working lives. Or so everyone thought. Or so everyone believed. Or so all the paperwork stated. But paperwork can be forged. Inspections can be faked if someone is clever and determined enough. And sometimes, hidden inside the mundane, boring routine of commercial aviation, there lurks something dark and intentional and deadly. What made this flight different, what made this particular flight absolutely extraordinary, wasn't the aircraft itself. It wasn't the perfect weather or the routine flight path or the early morning departure time. It was the passengers. Specifically, it was exactly one passenger sitting quietly in seat 14B, reading a book and minding her own business. Her name, according to her ticket and her government-issued identification card, was Emily Carter. The paperwork said she was 38 years old. Her occupation was listed as logistics consultant on her customs and immigration forms. She was dressed in casual traveling clothes, faded blue jeans that looked comfortable and well-worn, a soft gray sweater, white sneakers, and simple reading glasses perched on her nose. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore no makeup. No jewelry except for a simple, inexpensive watch on her left wrist. She looked exactly like any other business traveler making an early morning cross-country flight for work. She had boarded the aircraft alone during the priority boarding group. She moved efficiently through the jetway without wasting any time. She carried one small rolling carry-on bag and a worn leather messenger bag. She placed both items in the overhead bin with practiced ease, like someone who flew frequently and knew exactly what to do. She took her assigned window seat without speaking to anyone around her. She buckled her seatbelt immediately. When the flight attendant came by with a cheerful smile and offered her a pre-departure beverage, water, orange juice, or coffee, she declined politely with a smile and a small shake of her head. Once she was settled in her seat, she pulled out a well-worn paperback mystery novel from her messenger bag. The cover was bent and creased from being read many times. She opened it to a bookmarked page and began reading. Within moments, she appeared completely absorbed in her book, paying no attention to the other passengers still boarding around her. Nobody gave her a second glance. Nobody wondered about her. Nobody thought she was anything other than exactly what she appeared to be, another quiet business traveler trying to get some reading done before a long flight. Nobody questioned anything about the woman in seat 14B who minded her own business and read her mystery novel. But if you had looked very, very closely, if you were trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, if you knew exactly what behavioral tells to watch for, you might have noticed a few small details that didn't quite fit the image of an ordinary civilian consultant. The way her eyes swept across the entire cabin in one smooth motion the instant she sat down. She wasn't just looking around casually. She was cataloging exits and potential threats with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this exact assessment thousands of times before. It was muscle memory, an ingrained habit that she couldn't turn off even if she tried. How her gaze tracked and carefully assessed the two men in dark business suits who took seats 3 rows behind her. She watched them in her peripheral vision, never looking directly at them, never making it obvious, until she was completely satisfied that they posed no immediate threat to her safety. The way she positioned herself in her seat. She sat with her back protected by the window and the fuselage of the aircraft. This gave her a clear, unobstructed view of anyone approaching down the aisle. She could see threats coming. It was a defensive position, the kind of seat selection that trained operatives make automatically. The slight tension visible in her shoulders when someone walked past her row a bit too quickly, moving with purpose. Her body tensed, ready to react if necessary, then relaxed when the person moved past without incident. And if you had somehow managed to see beneath her gray sweater, if you had X-ray vision or medical imaging equipment, you would have noticed extensive scarring across her torso, arms, and shoulders. Burn scars on her left forearm, showing the distinctive pattern of thermal damage from an aircraft fire. The skin was puckered and discolored, marked by old wounds that had healed but left permanent damage. Shrapnel scars scattered across her back and shoulders, dozens of small marks where high-velocity metal fragments had torn through her flesh. The kind of wounds caused by exploding ordnance in combat. A badly healed fracture line visible in her left collarbone, evidence of a bone that had broken and been set without proper medical care. These scars told the story of someone who had been through severe trauma. Someone who had survived something terrible. Someone who had been injured in combat and lived to tell about it. The kind of scars you absolutely, positively do not get from working as a logistics consultant, no matter how dangerous the international job sites might be. Because Emily Carter wasn't really a logistics consultant. That was just her carefully constructed cover identity. It had been created by the Central Intelligence Agency over the course of 6 intensive months. Every detail had been painstakingly crafted. Background records. Employment history. Social media presence. Everything designed to create a completely believable civilian persona. This cover identity had been maintained successfully for the past 2 years without anyone discovering the truth. Her real name was Sarah Mitchell. 3 years ago, she had been Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Ghost, United States Air Force. She was an F-16 Fighting Falcon pilot assigned to the 421st Fighter Squadron, one of the most elite fighter units in the entire Air Force. She had flown 127 combat missions over hostile territory in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. She was the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest military decorations awarded for extraordinary achievement during aerial flight in combat. She had 2 confirmed air-to-air kills against enemy aircraft during combat operations, an extremely rare achievement in modern aerial warfare. She had accumulated more than 2,800 hours of flight time in high-performance fighter jets, making her one of the most experienced combat pilots in her generation. Her call sign, Ghost, had been earned during a particularly daring and dangerous nighttime strike mission over Syria 3 years before her supposed death. The mission briefing had been deceptively simple, but everyone in the room knew it was extremely dangerous, possibly suicidal: penetrate 60 miles deep into enemy-controlled airspace, strike 3 high-value targets with precision-guided weapons, and return to friendly territory without being detected or engaged by Syrian air defenses. Most pilots, even experienced combat veterans, would have considered this mission borderline impossible. The Syrian air defense network was one of the most sophisticated and heavily layered in the entire world. It featured overlapping radar coverage that left almost no blind spots. Multiple surface-to-air missile batteries positioned to cover every approach angle. Fighter aircraft on alert status, ready to scramble at a moment's notice to intercept any intruders. It was a nightmare scenario for any pilot. But Sarah Mitchell had flown that mission with absolute perfection. She flew so low and so fast that she was almost skimming the desert terrain. She used every terrain masking technique she had ever learned in training in combat. She exploited every radar blind spot created by mountains and valleys. She timed every turn to absolute perfection, staying inside the radar shadows. She was invisible. The Syrian ground radar operators never saw her coming. She dropped precision-guided bombs on all 3 targets, weapon storage facilities that were subsequently completely destroyed in massive explosions. Then she vanished back into the night sky, flying low and fast through the darkness. The Syrian air defenses didn't even realize an American aircraft had penetrated their airspace until 15 minutes after she was already safely back in friendly territory. She had been a ghost in the sky that night. Silent. Invisible. Deadly. There one moment, gone the next. Present only in the destruction she left behind. The call sign stuck immediately. From that night forward, she was known by everyone in the squadron, in the entire fighter community, as Ghost. It was a name that carried respect, even a certain amount of fear. Ghost was the pilot who could go anywhere, strike any target, and return safely. Ghost was the pilot who made the impossible look easy. Then came March 2021. Everything changed that day. It was supposed to be a routine combat air patrol mission over Afghanistan. Sarah's F-16 was providing air cover for U.S. Army ground forces conducting operations in a mountainous region near the Pakistani border. It was a standard close air support mission. She'd flown dozens of these missions before. The first 3 hours went perfectly smoothly, exactly according to plan. Until her aircraft was hit by a Russian-made Strela surface-to-air missile. The missile was fired by insurgent forces from a hidden launch position high up in the mountains. Sarah never saw it coming. The insurgents had positioned themselves perfectly, waiting for hours in the cold mountain air for a target to present itself. The missile's proximity warhead detonated just behind and slightly below her aircraft. The explosion sent hundreds of high-velocity metal fragments tearing through the F-16's fuselage and engine. Critical systems failed instantly. Hydraulic lines were severed, spraying fluid everywhere. The engine began losing power dramatically as turbine blades were damaged by shrapnel. Fire warning lights illuminated all across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree. The control stick went partially dead in her hands as hydraulic pressure dropped toward zero. Sarah had perhaps 4 seconds to make a life-or-death decision. Maybe less. She could try to nurse the crippled aircraft back toward friendly territory, hoping it would stay together long enough to reach safety. But she risked having it break apart in flight, which would kill her instantly. Or she could eject immediately while she still had sufficient altitude and airspeed to survive the ejection sequence. She chose to eject. It was the right decision. The only decision. She pulled the ejection handle. The Martin Baker ejection seat fired with explosive force, literally blasting her clear of the dying aircraft. Rocket motors propelled her upward and away from the disintegrating F-16. Just seconds after she ejected, her aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin and broke apart in midair. Pieces of the plane rained down across the mountainside, some parts still burning. Sarah's parachute deployed automatically at the pre-programmed altitude. She descended slowly toward the rugged, mountainous terrain below. She watched the burning wreckage of her aircraft scattered across the landscape. Each piece that hit the ground sent up a small explosion or a puff of dust. She landed hard in enemy-controlled territory. The rocky ground came up fast. She tried to roll with the impact, absorbing the force as she'd been trained during survival school. But she still hit hard enough to leave deep bruises across her entire right side. Her shoulder took most of the impact. For a moment she thought she might have broken something, but when she moved carefully, everything still worked. She immediately gathered up her parachute, stuffing the fabric into a ball so it wouldn't be visible from a distance. She activated her emergency locator beacon, the small radio transmitter that would guide rescue helicopters to her position. Then she began moving quickly toward what she hoped would be a safe extraction point. A clearing about 2 miles away where helicopters could land and pick her up. But the rescue helicopters never arrived. Because the insurgent fighters who had shot her down were already moving rapidly toward her position. They had spotters watching from the mountainside. These spotters had observed her parachute descent and marked exactly where she landed. The insurgents reached her position before the rescue helicopters could get there. It was a race, and the insurgents won. Armed men surrounded her position within 20 minutes. She fought hard. Hand-to-hand combat training kicked in. She took down 2 of them before someone hit her from behind with a rifle butt, striking her hard across the back of her head. Everything went dark. She fell unconscious to the rocky ground. When she regained consciousness, she was bound with rough rope. Her hands were tied tightly behind her back. Her ankles were bound together. A dirty cloth was stuffed in her mouth as a gag. She was lying in the back of a truck, bouncing and jolting as the vehicle drove rapidly away from the crash site. She had no idea where they were taking her. The official U.S. military story was straightforward and tragic. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, F-16 pilot, shot down by enemy fire over Afghanistan. Aircraft completely destroyed. Pilot successfully ejected but landed in hostile territory controlled by insurgent forces. Extensive search and rescue operations were conducted for 72 continuous hours. Multiple helicopter flights searched the area. No trace of the pilot was found. Hostile forces controlled the entire region, making ground searches impossible. No body was recovered. After 72 hours with no contact, no beacon signal, and no evidence of survival, she was officially presumed killed in action. A memorial service was held at Arlington National Cemetery 6 weeks later. It was a beautiful spring day, unfortunately. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. It seemed wrong somehow that the weather should be so perfect for such a sad occasion. The ceremony included full military honors. Honor Guard. Flag-draped coffin, empty since there was no body to bury. The American flag was folded with crisp, perfect precision by white-gloved honor guards. It was presented to Sarah's elderly mother, who accepted it with shaking hands. Tears streamed down her face. She could barely stand, supported by family members on both sides. A 21-gun salute echoed across the cemetery grounds, the sharp cracks of the rifles making people jump. A lone bugler played taps in the gathering dusk, the mournful notes floating across the thousands of white headstones. Sarah Mitchell's name was carved into the memorial wall at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Her name joined the names of hundreds of other aviators who had given their lives in service to their country. Her fighter squadron held a special memorial formation flight. 4 F-16s flew in tight formation. Then one aircraft pulled up sharply and climbed away from the others, leaving a gap in the formation. The missing man formation. It's a tribute that brings tears to the eyes of anyone who understands its significance. The empty space in the sky represents the pilot who will never fly with them again. She was gone. Killed in action. Case closed. Her military file was marked as deceased. Her service records were sealed and archived. The investigation was concluded. Everything was finished. Except Sarah Mitchell hadn't actually died in Afghanistan. The real story, the classified story that only a handful of people in the U.S. intelligence community knew about, was far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone outside that small circle could imagine. Sarah had been captured alive by the insurgents who shot down her aircraft. But these weren't random Taliban fighters or local militia groups. These were professional operatives. They worked for a sophisticated, well-funded Russian-backed arms trafficking organization. This criminal network operated across Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and Central Asia. They moved weapons illegally across international borders. They laundered money through dozens of front companies. They trafficked intelligence to the highest bidder. They facilitated terrorist operations across the entire region. When these professional criminals realized they had captured an American F-16 pilot, a senior officer with extensive knowledge of U.S. air operations, tactics, and procedures, they knew immediately that they had captured something extremely valuable. Very valuable indeed. They held Sarah prisoner for 14 brutal months. 14 months of systematic, calculated torture specifically designed to break her will and extract every single piece of classified intelligence she possessed. They wanted to know everything about American military operations in the region. Flight tactics. Weapons systems capabilities. Operational security procedures. Communications protocols. Base locations. Everything. They moved her constantly between safe houses to avoid detection. Over 14 months, they transported her across 3 different countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally into Central Asia. They were always staying one step ahead of any American or Allied intelligence efforts to locate and rescue her. The torture was systematic and terrible. They waterboarded her repeatedly, simulating drowning until she thought her lungs would burst. They beat her with fists, boots, and rifle butts, leaving bruises and broken bones. They burned her with cigarettes and electrical prods, creating the permanent scars she still carries. They forced her into stress positions for hours at a time until her muscles screamed in agony and she thought she would go insane from the pain. They deprived her of sleep for days at a time until she was hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. They threatened to execute her daily, sometimes forcing her to kneel with a gun pressed against her head, pulling the trigger on an empty chamber just to hear her scream. But Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell did not break under this torture. She was stronger than they anticipated. She gave them nothing except her name, rank, and service number, exactly as she had been trained to do as a prisoner of war. Nothing else. No matter what they did to her, she gave them nothing. Instead of breaking under the torture, Sarah did something her captors never anticipated or imagined possible. Something that would ultimately lead to their complete destruction. She gathered intelligence on them. Even while being tortured, even while suffering unimaginable pain and degradation, she memorized everything she could observe. Faces of her captors and visitors to the safe houses. Names that were carelessly mentioned in conversations her captors thought she couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. Account numbers written on documents and computer screens that were left within her view. Shipping routes discussed during phone calls made in rooms where she was being held. Meeting locations. Operational procedures. The complete organizational structure of an international arms trafficking network that stretched from Afghanistan to Moscow to New York City. She memorized everything. Every single detail. Every name. Every date. Every transaction code. Every location. Building a complete intelligence picture in her mind, one small piece at a time, over the course of 14 brutal months of captivity. Her memory was phenomenal, trained through years of military discipline. She remembered everything. And then, after 14 months of captivity and torture, when an opportunity finally presented itself during a rushed, disorganized transfer between safe houses, Sarah Mitchell escaped. The escape was violent and desperate. She killed 2 guards during her breakout, using improvised weapons and hand-to-hand combat techniques she'd learned during survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SEER, training. She took their weapons, an AK-47 rifle and a pistol, along with whatever ammunition they carried. She took their water and what little food they had. Then she ran. She navigated across 150 miles of hostile territory over the course of 9 harrowing days and nights. She moved only at night, using darkness as cover. She hid during the day in caves, ditches, abandoned buildings, anywhere she could find concealment. She survived on whatever food and water she could find, steal, or scavenge. She drank from streams and irrigation ditches. She ate whatever she could find, fruit from trees, vegetables from fields, scraps from village garbage. She crossed international borders without documentation, sneaking past guard posts and patrols. She avoided checkpoints and military patrols by moving through rough terrain that vehicles couldn't access. She kept moving relentlessly toward what she hoped would be safety, driven by pure determination and survival instinct. Eventually, after a journey that nearly killed her at least 3 separate times, dehydration, infected wounds, almost being discovered by patrols, Sarah reached a CIA safe house in Turkey. She had walked, crawled, and climbed her way across 2 countries. When she finally stumbled through the door of the safe house, she was half dead. Severe dehydration. Multiple infected wounds. Broken bones that had healed badly. She collapsed on the floor and lost consciousness. CIA medical personnel worked frantically to save her life. They treated her wounds, gave her antibiotics and fluids, set her broken bones properly. It took 3 weeks before she was stable enough to begin talking. And then CIA intelligence officers debriefed her continuously for 6 months, extracting every single piece of information she had gathered during her captivity. The intelligence Sarah Mitchell provided was absolutely devastating to the arms trafficking network. She gave the CIA the complete organizational structure of the criminal enterprise, including specific names of everyone involved from street-level weapons dealers all the way up to the senior leadership in Moscow. She provided detailed bank account numbers used for international money laundering operations, allowing financial investigators to trace money flows. She identified shipping routes used to move weapons across international borders, enabling interdiction operations. She exposed corrupt government officials in 3 countries who were actively facilitating the illegal weapons trade in exchange for bribes. But the intelligence was so valuable, and Sarah herself was now so dangerous to the criminal network, that releasing her back into the world posed an enormous risk to her safety. The arms traffickers would immediately realize that their entire network had been comprehensively compromised by the American pilot who had escaped. They would hunt for her relentlessly and ruthlessly, determined to eliminate the witness who could destroy their entire multi-billion-dollar operation. The CIA made a difficult decision after consulting with military intelligence and the Department of Defense: keep Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell officially dead. Her death provided perfect cover. Give her a complete new identity, new background, new life. Place her in the Federal Witness Protection Program with a completely fabricated civilian persona that would withstand any investigation. use her intelligence to begin systematically dismantling the trafficking network while keeping her safe from retaliation. And so Emily Carter was born. Created from nothing. A complete false identity. For the past 2 years, Emily Carter had lived quietly and carefully in Portland, Oregon. She maintained her cover as a logistics consultant. She worked remotely for what appeared to be a legitimate defense contracting company but was actually a CIA proprietary operation. She did genuine consulting work on supply chain security issues for various companies, work that was real and provided legitimate income. She flew commercially a few times per year for work meetings and industry conferences, always maintaining her civilian cover identity perfectly. She knew the Russian arms dealers were still actively searching for the American pilot who had escaped their captivity. Russian intelligence services were helping them search, providing technical capabilities like facial recognition and surveillance. But they were looking for Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, military officer with short military haircut, combat flight suit, military bearing and posture, someone who carried themselves like a fighter pilot and officer. They were not looking for Emily Carter, quiet civilian consultant who deliberately blended into crowds, who read mass-market paperback novels on commercial flights, who dressed in jeans and sweaters, who looked like absolutely anyone and everyone, completely unremarkable and forgettable. The cover identity had worked perfectly for 2 years without any problems. Sarah had begun to believe she might actually be safe for the long term. She might be able to live out the rest of her life as Emily Carter without ever being discovered. Maybe the Russians would eventually give up their search. Maybe she could actually have something like a normal life. Until today. Until this morning. Until Delta Flight 2847. Because what Sarah didn't know, what she had absolutely no way of knowing, was that 3 weeks ago, Russian military intelligence, GRU, had run sophisticated facial recognition software through 6 full months of archived security camera footage from all major U.S. airports. They were searching systematically for any possible trace of the escaped American pilot, using advanced artificial intelligence algorithms. The software had flagged a potential match at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport from footage recorded 2 days earlier. The woman who had checked in as Emily Carter for Delta Flight 2847 had been matched to an archived military personnel photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell with 94.7% confidence. The facial recognition algorithm had compared hundreds of specific facial measurement points. The facial bone structure was identical. The distance between eyes was identical. The general facial proportions and ratios were identical. The software accounted for different hair, different clothing, different makeup and styling. What mattered was the underlying facial structure, the bones beneath the skin. Those never change. 94.7% confidence was more than close enough to warrant taking action. It was close enough to kill. And so Russian intelligence officers, working in coordination with the arms trafficking network that wanted Sarah dead, had done something brilliantly simple and absolutely terrifying in its implications. They had contaminated the fuel for Delta Flight 2847. A sleeper agent who had been working undercover as a maintenance contractor at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport for the past 14 months, positioned there specifically for this type of operation, had accessed the airport's main fuel farm. He spent 47 minutes alone with the fuel storage tanks that supplied gates in Terminal A. During that time, he deliberately introduced massive amounts of water, sediment, and biological contaminants into the specific tanks that would be used to fuel Delta Flight 2847. The contamination was severe enough to cause catastrophic, total engine failure. Both engines. Simultaneous failure. At cruising altitude over the Rocky Mountains, far from any suitable emergency landing airport. The aircraft would lose all power and crash in the mountains. Everyone aboard would die in the crash. No survivors. And the death of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell would be attributed to a tragic but explicable accident, contaminated fuel from a maintenance error or equipment failure. Nothing more. No investigation would connect it to Russian intelligence operations. No evidence would point toward assassination. Just another terrible accident in the long history of commercial aviation, like so many others. The plan was absolutely perfect. Elegant in its simplicity. Untraceable. Deniable. Except for one critical thing the Russian intelligence officers had failed to consider in their planning. The woman they were trying to murder was the only person on that entire aircraft who possessed the specific combat skills, training, and experience necessary to save everyone aboard when both engines failed. Everything proceeded normally and routinely during the boarding process, taxiing to the runway, takeoff, initial climb, and the first 25 minutes of cruise flight at 31,000 feet. In the cockpit, Captain Rebecca Hayes sat in the left seat, the captain's position. She was 49 years old with 28 years of commercial flying experience. She had logged more than 16,000 flight hours, most of them in Boeing aircraft. She'd flown this exact route, Seattle to Boston, literally hundreds of times over her career. She knew every waypoint, every alternate airport, every weather pattern. This was as routine as brushing her teeth in the morning. First Officer Marcus Webb occupied the right seat, the co-pilot's position. He was 42 years old, an ex-Navy pilot who had flown F/A-18 Hornets off aircraft carriers before transitioning to commercial aviation. He had 9,000 hours of flight time. He was competent, professional, and calm under pressure. He and Rebecca had flown together many times. They worked well as a team. Rebecca had handled the takeoff herself, as was her preference on morning flights. The takeoff was clean, professional, textbook perfect. Rotate at exactly the right speed. Smooth climb out. Gear up. Flaps retracted on schedule. Everything by the numbers. Marcus monitored the instruments carefully and called out altitudes as they climbed. Passing 10,000 feet. Passing 15,000. Passing 20,000. His voice was calm and professional on the intercom. They reached their assigned cruising altitude of 31,000 feet at 7:08 a.m., 26 minutes after takeoff. The autopilot was engaged. The flight management computer was flying the aircraft along the programmed route. Everything was working perfectly. Rebecca was now reviewing the flight plan on her electronic tablet, double-checking fuel calculations and weather forecasts for Boston. Standard procedure. Marcus was eating a breakfast sandwich he'd brought from home, something his wife had made for him that morning. The cabin crew, 3 flight attendants, had begun beverage service in the main cabin, pushing their carts slowly down the aisles. In seat 14B, Sarah Mitchell, traveling as Emily Carter, appeared to be reading her paperback mystery novel. But she was also listening carefully, as always. It was a combat habit that never went away, no matter how hard she tried. Always listening to the engines. Always monitoring the aircraft's sounds and vibrations. Always aware of her environment. She'd been on hundreds of commercial flights since entering witness protection 2 years ago. Every flight, her combat-trained mind automatically monitored everything. Engine sounds. Changes in pitch. Vibrations through the airframe. The feel of the aircraft in flight. She couldn't turn it off. It was as automatic as breathing. Then, at exactly 7:10 a.m., at 31,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, she heard something wrong. It was very subtle. Most passengers wouldn't have noticed it at all. The left engine's pitch changed slightly. Not much. Just a small fluctuation in the normal, steady hum that fills every commercial aircraft. A slight drop in RPM. A change in the harmonic frequency of the engine noise. Sarah's extensively trained ear caught it immediately. That sound, that specific change in pitch, indicated fuel flow inconsistency. She'd heard that exact sound before in combat when her F-16 had taken ground fire that damaged fuel lines. She knew what it meant. She sat up straighter in her seat. Closed her book carefully, marking her place. Started listening even more carefully to both engines. 10 seconds later, the right engine made the same sound. Both engines were now showing signs of fuel starvation. Both engines having fuel problems at the same time. That was extremely unusual. That almost never happened unless something was very, very wrong. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt quietly, trying not to draw attention. She stood up slowly and calmly, not rushing but moving with purpose. The man in the aisle seat next to her looked up. "Everything okay?" "Just need to stretch my legs," Sarah said with a casual smile. Long flight ahead. Captain Rebecca was the first person in the cockpit to notice the warning lights appearing on her primary flight display. "Fuel pressure low on engine 1, she said, frowning as she studied the display. Her voice was calm but concerned. This wasn't normal. This shouldn't be happening. Marcus immediately checked his own instruments, cross-referencing the warnings. Engine 2 showing the same indication. That's very strange. We've got 3/4 fuel in the tanks. More than enough. This doesn't make sense. Rebecca's training took over immediately. Run the fuel system checklist. Let's figure out what's happening. Marcus opened the quick reference handbook, the emergency procedures manual that every commercial pilot knows by heart but still references during actual emergencies. He started reading through the fuel system malfunction checklist. Fuel pumps, checking, all showing normal operation. Crossfeed valves, checking, configured correctly. Fuel temperature, checking, normal range. No blockages indicated in the fuel lines. Everything looks normal on the checklist, but we're still showing low pressure on both engines. But even as he spoke, the fuel pressure gauges for both engines continued dropping steadily. The needles moved slowly but inexorably toward the red warning zones. Rebecca's hands tightened on the control yoke. She'd been flying for 28 years and had never seen this particular combination of problems. This isn't right. Something's very wrong here. Then the left engine coughed. It was a sound that made both pilots freeze. The engine sputtered like a car running out of gas. Then it quit completely. Engine 1 flame out. Marcus shouted, his voice rising with stress for the first time. He immediately began the engine restart procedure from memory, his hands moving rapidly across the overhead panel, trying to restart the dead engine. Rebecca's hands flew to the controls, taking direct manual control of the aircraft as the autopilot automatically disconnected when it detected the engine failure. Beginning restart procedure. Stay calm. Before Marcus could even complete the first step of the restart checklist, the right engine made the same terrible sputtering sound. Then it died too. Both engines were now completely dead. Complete and utter silence filled the cockpit. No engine roar. No familiar vibration. Just the sound of wind rushing past the fuselage and the beginning sounds of 219 passengers in the cabin behind them realizing that something was very, very, very wrong. Rebecca's professional training took over completely. Her voice became calm and controlled as she keyed the radio, speaking to air traffic control, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Denver Center, this is Delta 2847. We have dual engine failure at flight level 310. Both engines have flamed out completely. We are unable to restart either engine. We are currently gliding. We have 219 souls on board." There was a shocked pause on the radio. Then the air traffic controller's voice came back, trying to stay professional despite the obvious stress. "Delta 2847, Denver Center, confirm you have both engines failed." "Both engines?" "Affirmative, Denver Center. Complete dual engine flameout. All restart attempts have failed. Both engines are completely dead. We are now gliding unpowered. We need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." Another pause. The controller was probably checking his radar scope, calculating distances. "Delta 2847, the nearest suitable airport for a Boeing 757 is Denver International Airport, currently 73 miles at your 9 o'clock position, bearing 270 degrees. Rebecca and Marcus both immediately looked at the glide performance calculator displayed on their navigation screens. The computer would tell them if they could reach Denver International or not. The math was brutally simple. A Boeing 757's glide ratio without engine power, approximately 15 to 1. For every mile of altitude, the aircraft could glide approximately 15 miles forward. Current altitude, 31,000 feet above sea level, which equals approximately 5.9 miles of altitude. Maximum theoretical glide range in perfect conditions, approximately 88 miles. Distance to Denver International Airport, 73 miles. The math said they could make it to Denver. Barely. They had just enough altitude. But that was assuming absolutely perfect conditions. No headwind. No pilot errors. Perfect, precise piloting with no wasted altitude. And most critically, starting the glide immediately with no altitude loss from turning or maneuvering. Every foot of altitude they lost to anything other than forward glide was altitude they couldn't get back. They had no engines to climb. They were falling, albeit in a controlled manner. Rebecca carefully, gently banked the massive aircraft toward Denver. Every movement had to be smooth and precise. Banking too steeply would bleed off precious altitude faster. Marcus, keep trying the engine restart procedures. Try everything. I'm configuring for maximum range glide. We need every foot of altitude we can get. Flight attendant Linda Chen was in the middle of the cabin with the beverage cart when she felt the engines die. The change was impossible to miss. The steady vibration that passengers don't consciously notice but is always there, it stopped. The engine noise that forms constant background white noise, it went silent. Linda froze. She'd been a flight attendant for 12 years. She knew immediately that something terrible was happening. Her training took over. She abandoned the beverage cart and picked up the PA handset with slightly shaking hands. She forced her voice to stay calm and professional as she made the announcement that flight attendants dread having to make. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing some engine difficulties. There is no immediate danger, but as a precautionary measure, we need everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened securely. Please follow all crew member instructions. Remain calm. But passengers weren't remaining calm. People aren't stupid. They could hear that the engines were completely silent. They could feel that the aircraft was gliding, descending slowly but steadily. They knew this wasn't just some engine difficulties. This was catastrophic. Panic began spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Some passengers immediately began praying out loud, hands clasped, eyes closed. Some started crying, tears streaming down their faces. Parents grabbed their children tightly, holding them close. A few people began screaming. Someone in the back of the cabin started hyperventilating, breathing rapidly into an air sickness bag. Sarah Mitchell was still standing in the aisle 3 rows from the cockpit, her hand gripping a seat back for balance. She was doing rapid calculations in her head, drawing on years of flight training and combat experience. Boeing 757 aircraft. Dual engine failure, both engines completely dead. Current altitude approximately 31,000 feet. Standard glide ratio for this aircraft type, 15 to 1 under ideal conditions. But they weren't in ideal conditions. Wind from the west, she could feel the slight drift. She estimated maybe 30 knots of headwind component based on the weather briefing she'd overheard earlier while boarding. Headwind cuts effective glide range by approximately 15 to 20%. She did the math quickly, 88 miles maximum glide range in perfect conditions. Minus 15% for headwind equals approximately 75 miles effective range. Denver International was 73 miles away according to what she'd overheard on her hidden radio scanner app. The numbers were close. Very close. Too close. They might make Denver International. But more likely they would fall 5 to 8 miles short. They would crash in the mountains just short of the airport. Unless someone in that cockpit knew how to extend the glide beyond normal parameters. Unless someone knew advanced tactical glider techniques from flying combat jets with battle damage. Unless someone knew how to read the atmosphere, find rising air, use every trick in the book to stay airborne just a little bit longer. Sarah made her decision in less than 2 seconds. She moved quickly but calmly toward the cockpit door. Linda Chen, the head flight attendant, saw her moving forward and immediately moved to intercept her. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately. The cockpit is off limits to all passengers." "I'm a pilot," Sarah said quietly but firmly, making eye contact with Linda. "U.S. Air Force. I can help them. I need to get into that cockpit right now." "Ma'am, I cannot allow civilians into the cockpit during any circumstance, especially during an emergency." Sarah leaned close to Linda and whispered urgently, speaking quickly, "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, call sign Ghost. I am a combat F-16 pilot with more than 2,800 hours flight time. If you don't let me into that cockpit right now, everyone on this plane is going to die when we crash in the mountains. We will fall short of Denver. I know how to extend the glide. I can save everyone. Check my identification if you want, but do it fast because we're running out of altitude every single second." Linda looked at the identification card Sarah handed her. It clearly said Emily Carter. But something in Sarah's eyes, the absolute certainty, the unmistakable command presence, the complete absence of fear, made Linda believe her despite the name discrepancy. This woman was telling the truth. She was military. She was a pilot. And maybe, just maybe, she really could help. Linda made her decision. She pulled out her crew member access card and swiped it through the cockpit door lock panel. She entered the emergency override code that she'd memorized during training but never thought she'd actually use. The cockpit door lock clicked open with a soft beep. Sarah pushed through immediately. Sarah Mitchell pushed into the cockpit decisively. Captain Rebecca Hayes and First Officer Marcus Webb were both completely focused on running through emergency restart checklists, desperately trying to get at least one engine back online. Their hands moved rapidly across the overhead panels, trying different restart procedures. Nothing was working. Both engines remained completely dead, unresponsive to every attempt. "Who the hell are you?" Rebecca snapped without even looking up from her instrument panel. Her voice was sharp, stressed. She didn't have time for interruptions. "I'm someone who can help you," Sarah said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And I need you to understand something immediately, you are not going to make Denver International Airport. The math doesn't work." Rebecca finally looked up at her, this woman in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater, standing in her cockpit during the worst emergency of her entire flying career. "Get out of my cockpit. We don't have time for this." Sarah interrupted her, speaking quickly but clearly, "Captain Hayes, listen to me carefully. You have 73 miles to Denver International. Your glide range in these current wind conditions is approximately 65 miles maximum. You are going to fall 8 miles short. You will crash in the mountains with everyone aboard. I can extend your glide beyond normal parameters. I can save everyone on this aircraft. But you need to let me help you right now." Marcus stared at her, his eyes wide. "How do you know our exact glide performance parameters? How do you know the winds aloft? Who are you?" Sarah looked directly at both of them and spoke in a command voice they both recognized instantly, the voice of a military officer who is accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, call sign Ghost. I have 127 combat missions. I've glided crippled F-16 fighters with battle damage through worse conditions than this. I know tactical gliding techniques that can extend your range beyond what any commercial pilot has ever been taught. I know how to make a dead aircraft fly longer and farther than it should. Let me help you." Rebecca's professional training was screaming at her, no civilians in the cockpit ever. No unverified personnel. Follow protocol. Follow regulations. Follow the rules. But her survival instinct was screaming even louder, we're going to crash. We're all going to die. This woman sounds like she knows exactly what she's talking about. She sounds military. She sounds competent. What do we have to lose by listening to her? Rebecca made a split-second decision. Fine. What's your plan? Talk fast. Sarah immediately slid into the jump seat directly behind the two pilots, buckling herself in with practiced efficiency. First, stop trying to restart the engines. You're wasting precious altitude with the maneuvering required for restart attempts. Accept that they are dead and focus on gliding. Second, I need to transmit on a military emergency frequency. Right now. Why do you need military frequency? Marcus asked, his hands already moving to configure the radio as instructed. Because when I transmit my call sign, Black Hawk helicopters are going to scramble immediately from Fort Carson. And we're going to need them for several reasons. They can verify what I'm about to tell you, and they can document what's about to happen. Plus we need them to confirm something important. Rebecca nodded sharply to Marcus. Give her the military emergency frequency. Let her transmit. Sarah took the radio microphone and keyed it, speaking in the clear, professional tone that all military aviators use on radio. Any United States military aircraft or facility monitoring this frequency, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, call sign Ghost, currently aboard Delta Airlines Flight 2847. We have experienced dual-engine flameout. All engine restart attempts have failed. We are currently attempting an unpowered emergency landing. I am requesting immediate military assistance and helicopter escort. Please respond. For several seconds, there was only silence on the radio. Shocked, stunned silence. Then a voice came back, clearly stunned and disbelieving, aircraft calling on military emergency frequency, say again your call sign. Repeat your call sign. This is call sign Ghost. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell. United States Air Force Service Number 447-88-9201. I am currently alive and aboard a civilian Boeing 757 with complete dual-engine failure. I need Black Hawk helicopters airborne immediately to escort us and to verify something critical. At Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, the duty officer sitting in the command center nearly fell out of his chair when he heard that transmission. His hands were actually shaking as he pulled up the classified personnel file on his computer. The file was very clear: Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Ghost, United States Air Force, F-16 pilot, was listed as Kia, killed in action, in Afghanistan in March 2021. Memorial service conducted. Name on the memorial wall. Case closed. Deceased. But the voice recognition software that was analyzing the radio transmission was showing a 97.3% match to archived voice recordings of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell from mission debrief tapes. 97.3%. That was way too high to be coincidence or someone imitating her voice. The duty officer's voice was shaking slightly as he responded, Ghost, this is Peterson Space Force Base Command. We have you listed as killed in action in Afghanistan in March 2021. Please explain this discrepancy immediately. Sarah's voice came back calm and professional. Peterson Command, I was held in classified witness protection under a different identity. I will provide a full debrief later. Right now I need Black Hawk helicopters airborne immediately to escort Delta 2847 and to confirm something critical: this was not an accident. You need to immediately test the fuel that was loaded onto this aircraft. We were deliberately sabotaged. Russian arms dealers. They found me. They contaminated our fuel intentionally to cause this engine failure. They're trying to kill me by making it look like an accident. They're trying to murder 219 people to eliminate one witness. The duty officer was scrambling now, typing rapidly on his computer. Ghost, stand by. Scrambling helicopters immediately. Within exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds, for U.S. Army UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from Fort Carson Military Base, their powerful turbine engines screaming as they climbed rapidly toward Delta 2847's last known position. The lead Black Hawk pilot was Lieutenant Colonel Jake Harrison, call sign Viper. He was an experienced combat helicopter pilot with multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. As his helicopter climbed toward altitude, he keyed his microphone. "Ghost, this is Viper lead. We are airborne and inbound to your position. Estimated time to intercept is 7 minutes. Confirming for my own situational awareness, are you claiming to be the same Ghost from the 421st Fighter Squadron? The Ghost who flew the Syria penetration mission?" Sarah's voice came back immediately, still calm despite the desperate situation. "Affirmative, Viper. I'm the same pilot. And I'm about to do what I did over Syria, fly a dead aircraft through impossible conditions and land it safely anyway. I just need you and your flight to escort us, verify what I'm doing, and document everything for the investigation that's going to follow." "Copy that, Ghost," Viper responded, his voice filling with respect. "We've got your back. Show us what the 421st taught you. Show us how to fly the impossible." For the next 18 minutes, Sarah Mitchell taught two highly experienced commercial airline pilots how to fly like combat pilots dealing with catastrophic battle damage. "Rebecca," Sarah began, her voice calm and instructive, "I need you to completely change how you're thinking about this aircraft. It's not a Boeing 757 anymore. Right now, in this moment, it's a 120-ton glider. Nothing more. Every single movement you make costs energy. Every turn bleeds off altitude that you can never get back. We are going to fly this aircraft so precisely and so efficiently that the laws of physics will have no choice but to give us those extra 8 miles we need to survive." Sarah started making micro-adjustments to their flight path and configuration, calling out specific instructions. "Airspeed needs to be exactly 210 knots. Not 215, not 205. Exactly 210. That's the best lift-over drag speed for a 757 at this weight. Maximum efficiency. Every knot faster or slower reduces our range. Bank angle never exceeds 5 degrees for any turn. Even turning toward Denver is costing us altitude. Turns kill glide performance. Keep it shallow. Now look out to your 2 o'clock position. See that ridge line? See how the clouds are building vertically just behind it? That's a thermal column forming. That's rising air. Wind hitting the ridge is being pushed upward, creating lift. We are going to fly through that rising air." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "You want to use thermals? Like a sailplane glider pilot would do?" "Exactly like a glider pilot," Sarah confirmed. "I've done this with F-16s in combat. When your engine gets damaged by ground fire and dies over enemy territory 200 miles from friendly lines, you learn to read the sky like a book. Thermals, mountain wave lift, wind deflection patterns, it's all energy we can harvest and use to stay airborne longer." For the next 18 minutes, Sarah coached them through advanced techniques that no commercial airline pilot is ever taught in their standard training. Mountain wave lift: when wind deflects upward off a mountainside, it creates a column of rising air. By flying along the ridgeline at the right altitude and position, they could reduce their descent rate significantly. Sarah guided them to fly parallel to several ridge lines, harvesting the lift. Thermaling: warm air rising from sun-heated ground creates invisible columns of lift called thermals. Glider pilots circle in these thermals to gain altitude. Sarah couldn't make them circle, that would waste too much altitude, but she could guide them to fly through the rising air, briefly reducing their sink rate. Energy management: this was the most critical skill. Trading airspeed for altitude at exactly the right moments. If they flew too fast, they wasted energy as drag. If they flew too slow, they would stall. Sarah constantly monitored their energy state, making tiny corrections: speed up 2 knots, now slow down 3 knots, hold it right there, perfect. The 4 Black Hawk helicopters were now flying in formation around the gliding 757, their pilots watching in absolute amazement at what they were seeing. Viper keyed his radio to Peterson. Command, Peterson, this is Viper lead. Ghost is flying tactical energy management techniques on a commercial airliner. She's extending the glide performance beyond the published book numbers for this aircraft. I've been flying for 20 years and I have never seen anything like this. She's reading atmospheric conditions, finding lift, managing energy state like she's flying a sailplane. This is incredible. Inside the 757 cockpit, Rebecca was sweating heavily despite the cool cabin temperature. Her hands were rock steady on the control yoke, but the stress was enormous. She was following Sarah's instructions precisely, trusting this stranger who claimed to be a dead Air Force pilot. How do you know all of this? Where did you learn these techniques? Sarah's voice was quiet, almost distant. Combat missions over Syria and Afghanistan. My F-16 took ground fire on 3 separate occasions. Engine damage. Fuel leaks. Hydraulic failures. When you're 200 miles deep in enemy territory and your engine is dying, you don't get to call for a tow truck. You don't get a second chance. You glide to the extraction point or you die in enemy hands. So you learn. You learn to read every whisper of wind. You learn to find every updraft. You learn to feel the air beneath your wings. You learn to make a crippled aircraft do impossible things because your life depends on it. Every single time. Marcus was monitoring the navigation display, watching the distance to Denver International Airport decrease slowly. Too slowly. We're at 12,000 feet altitude. Denver International is 34 miles ahead. Ghost, we're still not going to make it. Even with everything you've done, the math still doesn't work. Sarah had been expecting this. She'd been doing her own calculations continuously. I know. Even with tactical energy management, we can't reach Denver International. But there is an alternative, and we need to commit to it right now before we lose too much altitude. She pointed at a small icon on the navigation display. Front Range Airport. It's a small regional airport 30 miles closer than Denver International. The runway is 8,000 feet long. That's tight for a 757, very tight, but it's physically possible. More importantly, it's the only runway we can actually reach with the altitude we have remaining. Rebecca stared at the small airport symbol. That's a tiny airport. It's barely adequate for regional jets. I don't think a 757 has ever landed there. And after today, one will have, Sarah said firmly. Call it in to Denver approach. Tell them we're diverting. We need the runway cleared immediately. Rebecca hesitated for only a second. Then she keyed the radio. Denver approach, Delta 2847 is diverting to Front Range Airport. We will not make Denver International. Repeat, we cannot reach Denver International. We are diverting to Front Range. There was a shocked pause from the controller. Delta 2847, Front Range Airport runway is only 8,000 feet long. That is below published minimums for a Boeing 757. Company procedures do not authorize. Denver approach, Rebecca interrupted, her voice hard. I don't care about company procedures right now. I care about not crashing in the mountains. Front Range is the only runway we can reach. Clear all traffic from Front Range immediately and have every single emergency vehicle you can find standing by on the field. We are landing there whether it's authorized or not. Roger, Delta 2847, the controller responded, his voice shaking slightly. Clearing Front Range Airport. Emergency vehicles are being scrambled. Good luck to you and your passengers. We're all praying for you here. At 3,000 feet above ground level, Sarah walked Rebecca through the final approach procedures step by step. Landing gear down at 2,000 feet, not 1 foot higher. We need to preserve every bit of energy until the absolute last possible moment. The gear creates enormous drag that will kill our glide performance. Full flaps at 500 feet above ground. Again, not before. Flaps create drag. Maintain airspeed at 140 knots until we're established on final approach. Then slow to 130 knots. Any slower and we risk a stall. Any faster and we'll use up too much runway. Rebecca, listen to me very carefully now. Sarah's voice became even more serious. You get exactly one shot at this landing. One chance. There is no go-around possible. If you miss the approach or land long, there are no engines to power back up for another try. You put the main wheels on the runway threshold numbers, the very beginning of the runway, and you brake like every life on this aircraft depends on it. Because every life does depend on it. Rebecca nodded, her jaw set with grim determination. Her hands were steady on the controls. Understood. One shot. I'll make it count. At 2,000 feet, Marcus pulled the landing gear lever. 3 dull thuds reverberated through the airframe as the gear doors opened and the landing gear extended into the slipstream. 3 green lights illuminated on the instrument panel, confirming all 3 landing gear were down and locked in position. At 500 feet above the ground, Front Range Airport's runway came into view ahead. It looked impossibly short from the cockpit. Impossibly narrow. Emergency vehicles were lined up along both sides of the runway, their red and blue lights flashing urgently in the morning sun. Fire trucks. Ambulances. Police vehicles. All waiting. Full flaps, Sarah commanded. Marcus moved the flap lever to full extension. The wing trailing edges extended downward, increasing lift but also creating enormous drag. The aircraft's nose wanted to pitch down. Rebecca compensated smoothly with back pressure on the yoke. At 200 feet, Sarah's voice was calm and steady, beginning the flare. Gently pull back on the yoke. Don't let the nose drop. Keep it coming up slowly. Easy, easy, hold it off the runway, hold it, hold it. The main landing gear wheels touched down exactly on the white threshold markers at the very beginning of the runway. The contact was firm but controlled. Not a gentle touchdown, but not hard enough to damage anything. It was perfect. Full spoilers. Deploy now. Sarah commanded. Rebecca instantly pulled the spoiler handle. The wing panels on top of the wings rose up, destroying the aerodynamic lift and pushing the aircraft firmly onto the runway. The weight of the aircraft settled fully onto the landing gear. Maximum brakes. Everything you've got. Sarah shouted. Rebecca's feet pressed the brake pedals as hard as she physically could. The anti-skid system prevented the wheels from locking up and skidding, but it was allowing maximum braking force. The deceleration was violent. Passengers in the cabin were thrown forward hard against their seatbelts. Several people hit their heads on the seatbacks in front of them. Overhead storage bins popped open from the deceleration forces. Carry-on bags and personal items tumbled out into the aisles. People were screaming, crying, praying out loud. The end of the runway was approaching fast. Much too fast. Marcus called out distances, his voice tight with stress. 6,000 feet of runway used. 2,000 feet remaining. The aircraft was still going way too fast. They were decelerating, but not fast enough. 7,000 feet used. 1,000 feet remaining. Rebecca was standing on the brakes with all her strength. The brake temperatures were in the red zone. Wisps of smoke rose from the main landing gear. 7,500 feet used. 500 feet remaining. The end of the runway was right there. They were still rolling at dangerous speed. If they overran the runway, the aircraft would likely break apart. 7,700 feet. 300 feet. The aircraft was slowing rapidly now, the brakes at their absolute maximum capability. 7,750 feet. 250 feet. Rebecca felt the aircraft slowing dramatically. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. The aircraft finally rolled to a complete stop. 7,760 feet of runway used, Marcus said quietly, his voice shaking. 240 feet of runway remaining. Complete silence filled the cockpit for exactly 3 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the cabin behind them absolutely erupted in sound. People screaming with joy and relief. Crying uncontrollably. Praying loudly, thanking God. Strangers hugging each other. Parents holding their children and sobbing with relief. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in the jump seat, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She whispered softly to herself, "Ghost is back." The 4 Black Hawk helicopters circled the runway once, then landed nearby in an empty field. Lieutenant Colonel Viper Harrison was the first person to reach the Boeing 757. He watched as Sarah climbed down the emergency evacuation slide that the flight attendants had deployed. Viper saluted her formally. "Colonel Mitchell, that was the single most incredible piece of flying I have ever witnessed in my entire career. You just saved 219 lives using techniques I didn't even know were possible on an aircraft that size. Welcome back from the dead, ma'am." The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, descended on Front Range Airport within 2 hours of the emergency landing. They brought teams of investigators, forensic specialists, and equipment trucks. Fuel samples were immediately drawn from Delta Flight 2847's tanks and rushed to a mobile laboratory for analysis. The results came back within 3 hours. Massive contamination. The fuel contained high levels of water that had been deliberately introduced. Heavy sediment and particulate matter. Biological fungus growth indicating the contamination had been developing for at least 24 hours. Multiple chemical contaminants that had no business being in aviation fuel. The contamination levels were so severe that both engines had essentially been trying to run on toxic sludge instead of clean jet fuel. Engine failure was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. This level of contamination does not happen accidentally. Cannot happen accidentally. This was deliberate sabotage. FBI investigators immediately traced the contaminated fuel back through the supply chain to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport's main fuel tank farm. They pulled security camera footage from the fuel storage facility for the 24 hours preceding Flight 2847's departure. The footage showed a maintenance contractor accessing the specific fuel tanks that supplied Terminal A at 2:14 p.m. the day before the flight. The contractor swiped a valid access card and entered the secure area. He spent exactly 47 minutes and 22 seconds alone with the fuel tanks, far longer than any legitimate maintenance procedure would require. Normal inspections took maybe 10 minutes maximum. The contractor was identified through facial recognition and employment records as Dmitry Volkov, age 34, a Russian national who had been working as a subcontractor for airport maintenance services for the past 14 months. FBI agents immediately pulled Volkov's complete background. His credentials were expertly forged. His background check paperwork had been manufactured through identity theft and document fraud. He had infiltrated the airport contractor company specifically to gain access to the fuel systems, positioning himself for exactly this type of operation. He was a professional intelligence operative. Within 48 hours of the emergency landing, the FBI had executed a coordinated operation. Dmitry Volkov was arrested at 3:47 a.m. while attempting to cross into Canada at the Blaine, Washington border crossing. He had a fake passport and $50,000 in cash. 5 additional Russian intelligence operatives were arrested in coordinated early morning raids across the Seattle metropolitan area. All 5 had been under surveillance for the past 18 hours. International arrest warrants were issued through Interpol for 12 high-level arms dealers operating across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Sarah Mitchell's intelligence, all the information she had memorized during her 14 months in captivity, was used to dismantle the entire international arms trafficking network. Bank accounts holding more than $340 million were frozen. Weapons shipments worth millions were intercepted at borders. The criminal organization she'd been tracking for 3 years collapsed within 1 week. But the headline that appeared on every news network, every newspaper, every website around the world was this. 3 days after the emergency landing, Sarah Mitchell sat at a press conference beside Captain Rebecca Hayes and senior NTSB investigators. The conference room at the Denver Federal Building was packed with journalists from around the world. Cameras lined the back wall. This was international news. A reporter from CNN stood up first. "Colonel Mitchell, you were officially declared killed in action in Afghanistan in 2021. Your memorial service was held at Arlington Cemetery. Your name is on the memorial wall. How did you survive? Where have you been for 3 years?" Sarah leaned forward to the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "I was shot down over Afghanistan by a surface-to-air missile in March 2021. I successfully ejected from my F-16 but landed in insurgent-controlled territory. I was captured alive by a Russian-backed arms trafficking organization. I was held prisoner for 14 months. During that time, I was moved between safe houses in 3 different countries. I was systematically tortured for military intelligence. I did not break. Instead, I gathered detailed intelligence on their entire criminal network. I memorized names, accounts, routes, operations. After 14 months, I escaped and made it to a CIA safe house in Turkey. I debriefed for 6 months. The intelligence I provided was classified at the highest levels. For my personal protection and to preserve ongoing investigations, I was placed in federal witness protection with a completely new identity. I have been living as a civilian for the past 2 years. A reporter from the Washington Post: "Did you know the aircraft fuel had been sabotaged before the engines failed?" Sarah shook her head. "No. I didn't know until both engines died simultaneously. But the moment they both failed at the same time, I knew this wasn't an accident. Dual-engine failure from fuel contamination is extremely rare in modern aviation unless it's deliberate. Russian arms dealers and their intelligence service handlers have been actively hunting me for 3 years, trying to eliminate the witness who could destroy their organization. Today they found me through facial recognition. They tried to kill 219 innocent people just to eliminate one witness who knew too much. They failed because they didn't know I possess specialized skills they didn't account for." A reporter from the New York Times: "How did you know how to glide a Boeing 757 commercial airliner with no engines?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I didn't specifically know how to glide a 757. I'd never trained on that aircraft type. But I do know how to glide a crippled F-16 fighter jet through hostile enemy territory when your engine has been shot out by ground fire and you have exactly 1 chance to reach friendly lines before you're captured or killed. The fundamental principles are identical. Physics doesn't care whether you're flying a small fighter jet or a large commercial airliner. Energy management works exactly the same way. You read the wind patterns. You find areas of rising air. You manage your energy state precisely. You use every technique you know to stay airborne 1 more minute, extend your range 1 more mile. Today I simply applied those same combat techniques to a larger aircraft operating in a different environment. The principles translated perfectly." Captain Rebecca Hayes spoke up, her voice strong: "I want everyone to understand something clearly. Colonel Mitchell saved every single life on my aircraft. Without her specialized tactical knowledge and extensive combat flying experience, we would have crashed in the Rocky Mountains. We would have fallen short of any runway. Everyone aboard would have died. She walked into my cockpit and performed a miracle. She is a hero in the truest sense of that word." Final question from a reporter for BBC News: "Colonel Mitchell, what happens now? What's next for you?" Sarah looked directly into the cameras, knowing the arms dealers who tried to kill her would be watching. "I testify in federal court against the arms dealers. I provide every piece of intelligence I gathered. They go to prison for the rest of their lives. The trafficking network is permanently destroyed. And Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Ghost, stops hiding. I'm done being dead. I'm done living in the shadows. Ghost is back. 6 months later. Sarah Mitchell stood quietly at the Air Force Academy Memorial Wall in Colorado Springs. The wall is made of polished black granite, names carved in neat rows. Her name was still there, still carved in the stone where it had been placed 3 years earlier. But now it had been updated with an addendum. The new inscription read. A voice spoke behind her, "You're supposed to be dead, Colonel." She turned around. Standing there in his Air Force dress blues was General Marcus Webb, her former squadron commander from the 421st Fighter Squadron. He was older now, more gray in his hair, but his eyes were the same. Sarah smiled warmly. "I was dead, sir. For 3 years I was officially dead. But it turns out that dead pilots make excellent federal witnesses. All 12 of those arms dealers are now serving life sentences in federal supermax prisons. The entire trafficking network is completely dismantled. Billions of dollars in illegal weapons stopped from reaching terrorist organizations." General Webb nodded with satisfaction. "I read the classified debrief reports. Your testimony in federal court was remarkable. The intelligence you gathered while in captivity took down one of the largest international arms trafficking operations in modern history. Weapons that would have killed American soldiers and innocent civilians. You saved countless lives with that intelligence. Thank you, sir. So what happens to Ghost now? What happens to a dead pilot who came back to life?" General Webb handed her an official-looking folder with the Air Force seal on it. "We have a position opening that we think is perfect for you. Instructor pilot position at the Fighter Weapons School. Your job would be teaching tactical emergency procedures to the next generation of combat pilots. You would teach them exactly what you did, how to fly the impossible. How to bring a crippled aircraft home safely when every system says you should be dead. How to glide without power. How to read the atmosphere. How to manage energy. How to survive when survival shouldn't be possible." Sarah looked at her name on the memorial wall one more time. Then she looked up at the clear blue Colorado sky, where F-16s were conducting training exercises overhead. Their engines screamed as they climbed vertically into the sunshine. She could feel it calling to her. The sky. The aircraft. The mission. Everything she'd thought she'd lost forever. "Ghost doesn't hide anymore, sir," Sarah said firmly. "Ghost teaches. Ghost passes on the knowledge so other pilots can survive. Ghost makes sure her squadron is ready for anything." "When do I start?" "Monday morning, 0600 hours sharp." "Welcome back to active duty, Colonel." They saluted each other crisply. Sarah turned and walked toward the flight line, where student pilots were conducting pre-flight inspections on their training aircraft. She was home. Finally home. The Mitchell Protocol, officially named after Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, became mandatory training for all commercial airline pilots worldwide within 1 year of the Delta Flight 2847 incident. The Federal Aviation Administration, working with international aviation safety organizations, developed a comprehensive training program based on Sarah's tactical gliding techniques. The protocol teaches commercial pilots how to read atmospheric conditions to identify areas of thermal lift, how to recognize and use mountain wave patterns to extend unpowered glide range, how to maintain optimal glide airspeed under varying wind conditions, how to perform real-time energy management calculations during emergencies, how to identify alternative landing sites when primary airports are unreachable, how to execute maximum performance landings on short runways. Aviation safety experts estimate that the Mitchell Protocol will save hundreds of lives over the coming decades. Several simulation studies have shown that pilots trained in these techniques can extend glide range by 15 to 25% compared to standard procedures. Delta Flight 2847 is now permanently enshrined in aviation history, 219 souls saved by a woman who was officially dead. The aircraft itself, N627DL, was eventually repaired and returned to service, but Delta kept the flight number 2847 retired as a memorial. Captain Rebecca Hayes received the Airline Pilots Association's highest honor for exceptional professionalism and composure under impossible pressure. She was also awarded the FAA's Distinguished Service Award. First Officer Marcus Webb wrote a best-selling memoir about the incident titled, The Day Ghost Came Back, Inside the Miracle of Delta 2847. And Sarah Mitchell? She teaches at the U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School every single day, Monday through Friday, training the next generation of combat pilots. She tells every class of new students the same thing on their first day. When your engines fail and you're falling toward the earth with no power, no thrust, and no second chances, you have exactly two choices available to you. You can accept death and give up. Or you can fly the impossible. You can use every skill you possess, every technique you've learned, every ounce of determination you have, and you can make that aircraft do things the engineers say are impossible. I always choose to fly. And I'm going to teach you how to fly the impossible too. Call sign Ghost. Declared killed in action March 2021. Resurrected June 2024. Still flying impossible missions. Still saving lives. Still teaching others how to survive. The ghost that wouldn't stay dead.